Well, welcome back to the Ask Podcast. Hi, Greg. We are discussing culture again, so
Hi,
I hope
David.
you're in a cultural mood.
Absolutely. Whenever I hear of politics, I reach for my revolver, so culture is much better.
Okay, and of course, you're from the city of culture, Melbourne, so, do Melbourne and Sydney vie with one another in terms of trying to claim some kind of cultural preeminence? I know Melbourne's the sporting preeminence.
Is there a rivalry between Leeds and Manchester in England? I mean,
Yeah.
if there is, it must be that what Freud called the narcissism of small differences. And as someone who's lived in Sydney and Melbourne both for a long period, you find just the same range of folks in both cities, really. Melbourne doesn't have the harbour, but it does lots of other things well. I think Australians flatter themselves that there's some great mystical difference between Sydney and Melbourne, whereas from 3 feet out, you couldn't tell them apart, I would say.
Yeah. And it's interesting because, there's a sense in which we've got the Opera House, and I'd love to do a whole discussion on that at some other point, because we're discussing culture, and I know what we're going to discuss today, and it's interesting in your book as well. There isn't a great deal about music or art, and I thought I'd want to just mention those at the beginning because both of these have a phenomenal Christ influence, in many, many areas, don't they?
They do. So I should put you up against my publisher, David, because I had proposed a chapter, or at least a section of a chapter, on Christianity and music. So not really looking to the great sacred music, the famous masses by the great composers or Gregorian chant or anything like that, but or Jesu, joy of Jesu rising or what have you, but looking at popular contemporary music. And I ended up writing quite a lot about the Beatles song "Let It Be," which I think is absolutely inspired by the visit of the Archangel Gabriel to Mary. Let it be done to me according to your word, and so on. And Paul McCartney, Liverpool Catholic, all this was rattling around in his head. And he's a very, very shrewd, brilliant musical composer, and he knew exactly what he was doing. There's a wonderful spiritual dimension all the way through John Denver's music, and in a way, it's a sign of how popular culture is somehow again abandoning Christ. That 40 or 50 years ago, Christian references were everywhere in popular music. They're still in country and Western music. They're less so now in mainstream rock and pop. Although there are wonderful songs everywhere. Lou Reed, all kinds of people. Of course, Van Morrison. He's a bit mad, Van Morrison, but the best people are, of course. And the publisher said to me, just to finish that thought, the publisher said to me, look, half those song lyrics are just because words rhyme or words scan or something, and you're putting more interpretive weight on them than they can bear. And in any event, he talked me out of it.
Well, I think he was wrong, to be honest, because I think it fits your theme perfectly, reflects things. I was at a Van Morrison concert, and it was unbelievable because he treats his audience with total disdain. So he's basically signed up to do a 50-minute set, and then the previous night he couldn't be bothered and just walked off. And that night he did it, and then he did a 50-minute encore of one song, Gloria, in which he drank pints through it, had all kinds of solos. It was utterly outstanding. It was totally
Van
brilliant.
Morrison has sung about angels. He's sung about, there is a beautiful spiritual quality to There'd Be Days Like These. And, I love church music, but if at my funeral they played On the Bright Side of the Road, I think I'd be smiling if I was capable of smiling from wherever I might be at that time.
Well, it wouldn't be a Calvinist funeral anyway. This is a true story about Van Morrison, by the way. He had a boat, and he used to go up to the Western Isles, sail around the Western Isles in his yacht, and he would go into the Stornoway Free Church to hear the Gaelic Psalm singing, which he absolutely loved.
Well, I can believe it. That other great song of his, Whenever God Shines His Light on Me.
Light on Me, yeah.
I find this music utterly beautiful. He reminds me, this is a very strange association, but I always think of this Scottish writer James Kelman when I hear Van Morrison's music. There just seems to be some similar sensibility in them, really. Demotic and kind of just with an integrity of their own. As I say, Van Morrison's a bit mad, so is James Kelman. But, nothing wrong with that.
Well, listen, and the other thing is there, when we're talking about music, you see, I agree with you about music, but I would suggest that music that doesn't include spiritual themes or biblical themes is, in fact, very, very, very shallow and tinselly. And I would say that great rock music, for example, like you get Led Zeppelin and others, and I'm reflecting probably my age, but, they're not overtly Christian, but they contain questions and themes and so on that the Bible deals with. By the way, please forgive that knocking. I have no idea, but one of my neighbours is banging away, so this is just real life as it is, and whoever's listening to this, you can cope with us.
Absolutely. Well, David, just a final reflection on that. In the book I do write about the great Martin Luther King speech, I Have a Dream, and so on, and one of the great speeches in the history of human oratory, I think, and absolutely full of biblical cadence and biblical reference. I've been to the mountaintop, I've seen the promised land, and so on. This only a black pastor steeped in the Bible could have delivered that speech, and only an audience which knew something of the Bible could have appreciated that speech. The same is true of many of Abraham Lincoln's speeches. But the audience today, and then just a few short years later, we had Let It Be from the Beatles. Now, Paul McCartney wrote that about his mother, Mary, but he was very happy for it to be interpreted as being about the mother of Jesus, Mary. And it's so full of lines from the New Testament. Still, in times of darkness, Mother Mary comes to me, still a light shines. It's almost an exact, there is a light that shines in the darkness, straight from John's Gospel. But you wonder, would an audience even have the echo of such a reference today? I mean, if you've never ever heard those phrases at all, you might still be moved by them because they're inherently powerful, but they wouldn't have that wonderful echo that they had. For artists then, they could rely on the audience having a little smattering of biblical background. I think that's much harder today.
Yeah, it's interesting. I agree, it is, but I also think that this is part of you talk about smuggling Christ into culture. I think you can get biblical ideas and phrases in, and people may not understand or grasp those, but that may cause them to question. So I would often do stuff like that. I mean, I don't want to carry on with the music, but just to mention one other thing, I was at a concert of Leonard Cohen at Edinburgh Castle with my sister, and at one point I turned to her, there's 10,000 other people, and I said, Fiona, I think you and I and a handful of others are the only people who really get this concert. And she started laughing and she said, why? And I said, well, 50% of his lyrics about sex, and I assume most people here get that, but the other 50% are explicitly biblical.
That's great.
And they wouldn't, they just wouldn't get them.
Yeah.
And it's, that is true. By the way, on the art side of it, because I think the art's another one. I mean, I think for some people, art galleries are their cathedrals now. And I do think the power of art, the creator, the creative, and all that kind of stuff. I do think that in my own tribe, the Dutch Calvinists got it right. The rest of us, the Scots, got it wrong, but the Dutch Calvinists got it absolutely right. And you've got this tremendous art. But I do remember going to the New York Metropolitan Art Gallery, and I think they still do. They had it arranged according to centuries. And what amazed me was, the 14th, 15th, 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th centuries were absolutely crammed with people. The 20th century, you could have played five-a-side football.
Well, that's right. I mean,
the difference was just simply, you went around all these other ones, there was loads of religious themes.
Well,
does that not say something?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, a few years ago in London, I went to the Tate Gallery to look at an exhibition of Turner and the Masters, which was magnificent. And then I went to the Tate Modern Gallery, and I really wanted to get a psychiatric compensation voucher or something. I mean, it was everything. I mean, one gallery celebrated truth and beauty, which is where art should always seek. Art should always seek truth and beauty. And one gallery celebrated ugliness and deformity and almost you'd say vileness was its moral vision. And you think our culture's gone into a weird. So I'm not a preacher of cultural despair, but you think our culture has gone down a weird cul-de-sac of futility in much of modern art.
Yeah, there's a wonderful writer called Francis Schaeffer who I'd highly recommend, who goes into this a great deal, but he had a friend called Hans Ruckmacher who became the Surgeon General for the United States, and he's written this fabulous book, best book I've ever read on art, called Modern Art and the Death of a Culture. And he was quite for modern art, but he said basically without the biblical foundations, it just falls in on itself. So, by the way, I do need to show you this. It shows you, I do listen to you, Greg. Can you see this?
Ah, yeah, Tolkien's, the letters of J.R.R. Tolkien. Oh, that's wonderful.
Arrived today. So
fabulous. Yeah, I didn't even know it was still in print. That's amazing. So that's a modern paperback edition. That's great. You'll enjoy that so much. If you're a big Lord of the Rings fan, you'll like all that. But if not, you can just read it through the index for C.S. Lewis and marriage and so on. And
I'll read the whole thing. I love letters. Now, in the chapter, sorry, I'm just going to show this to folks. This book, this is what we are talking about, Christians. You mention, I think, the brothers Karamazov, basically any of Dostoevsky's, Anna Karenina, Tolstoy. But I would put this up with this in terms of its impact upon me emotionally, and partly it's just because of the sheer beauty of its writing, and that's Marilyn Robinson's Gilead. So can you tell us just something about how you got into Marilyn Robinson? Because I adore her, to be honest.
Well, my journey to Marilyn, I think she is the premier Christian novelist of the 21st century. And in fact, I think she's one of the great novelists of the 21st century altogether. My route to her was a bit roundabout. I greatly admire an American critic called Joseph Epstein, and I saw him claim once in reviewing the letters of Willa Cather that Willa Cather was the most successful American novelist. And at that point, I hadn't heard of Willa Cather, and I thought, well, this is a bit of a weird claim. So I looked up Willa Cather's books and started to read them, and at first I couldn't understand what the fuss was about because they didn't seem to have plot, witty dialogue and so forth, all the stuff that I like, conflict in novels. And then I found there was something just majestic and sweeping and grand and transcendent in Willa Cather, especially her overtly Christian novels. And then I think Marilyn Robinson is a direct descendant of Willa Cather. They're separated by 100 years. They're both Midwestern Christian female novelists who don't write in really the Anglo-Saxon tradition. They write in a much more European tradition. So they are novels of character and novels of ideas and novels of reflection. So there is a story, of course. The novel, as E.M. Forster said, must always tell a story. But in the book Gilead, which I think is Marilyn Robinson's greatest novel, but there's a 4-novel sequence around Gilead, and the others, Lila, Home, and Jack, are also majestic novels. Each one of them, it's almost like, any one of them would be the best novel you've ever read, except that you've read the others in the same sequence of 4. And Gilead, you couldn't imagine something less likely to succeed. Gilead is the story of a 77-year-old congregational minister, John Ames, in the Midwest, who has a heart condition. His life is coming to an end. He married late in life and has a 7-year-old son. And he writes an account of his life and thoughts for his son. And the reflection is historical, it's theological. There are long contemplative passages on what heaven will be like, and there are celebrations of the beauty of the earth. There are questioning sections about, can predestination really be consistent with free will and God's graciousness and so forth. There is also the story of his father and his grandfather. His father was a kind of a pacifist minister. His grandfather was a militant abolitionist who took up arms in the Civil War to free African Americans. So there's that fabulous historical dialogue. But really, you just enter into a different plane of existence. I mean, one reviewer said, "I can't say you're dead if you haven't read Marilynne Robinson, but I can't say you're fully alive." You know, it reminds me, Oberon Waugh once remarked, "I can't take anyone's troubles seriously if they haven't tried to lighten their mood by reading P.G. Wodehouse." Well, I almost agree with that reviewer about Marilynne Robinson. She doesn't go in for the purple passage, very much like Willa Cather. The power of the writing is in the pattern of the writing rather than the single magnificent sentence. And it is transcendently moving and profound. I found myself taking notes all the time, which you don't generally do in a novel. And that certainly didn't, delay the enjoyment of the novel for me, but it obviously affected you in a somewhat similar fashion.
Yeah, I think when I got into it, I have to say this, I have a female brain, or apparently, and I can multitask, so I read and I do various things. But I found with Gilead, at home, Lila as well, that I just wanted to stop. I didn't do anything else because it really was, it showed me the magnificence of words. And also, I'll tell you something that's really interesting, just what you just said there. I thought, this is insane. How can we have this wonderful writer writing about predestination and free will, and who's a big fan of Jonathan Edwards, the Puritan, who's a liberal progressive in the old American style of that,
yes.
Friend of Obama's, how does this, and again, I just thought, this is Christ in culture again. This is Christ getting in.
Absolutely.
And her being drawn by that and writing honestly about it in the same way as Hilary Mantel, when she writes the magnificent series about Cromwell. Do you know, it's so good. And what astounded me was Mantel's I don't think she's a Christian. And what got me about Mantel's was the same thing, that she wrote honestly, tried to understand what Christians believed, both Catholic and Protestant at that time. And I do think that's a wonderful thing.
Well, both Willa Cather and Marilynne Robinson were Christian. I mean, Willa Cather obviously long since dead. Willa Cather began as a Baptist and became an Episcopalian, but wrote the best books about the Catholic priesthood that I've ever read, especially Death Comes for the Archbishop. Marilynne Robinson is a Calvinist, and when you say someone is a Calvinist, you don't normally think of them as a liberal Democrat, best friend of Barack Obama. But, human beings constantly defy categories. And it's you're quite right to say that she writes honestly, but it's more than that, isn't it? Her books function as a narrative. You're very interested in what John Ames thinks and what happens in his life and what happens with his marriage to Lila and so on. But you're also profoundly absorbed in his own meditation, which is a deeply human meditation in the sense that it's not an academic consideration of heaven, but it's a consideration of heaven informed by his life, by his 55 years or whatever as a congregational minister. There's a beautiful passage. There's a bloke in it that he doesn't like very much, Jack, until right at the end he comes to, and he struggles all through the novel to feel loving towards Jack because it's his Christian duty to love Jack. And yet Jack is a rascal. Jack is a bad guy. Jack has abused women and been an alcoholic and so on. And Ames is very worried that Jack might inveigle himself into Lila's life after Ames is dead, and he's scared of Jack and he really doesn't like him. And he wrestles in his own mind with this. I can't feel this way towards Jack. It's not open to me as a Christian. And at one point he says, if Jack flung me down the stairs of my own house before I hit the bottom, my theology could work out how to forgive him. But if he injured you, and he's writing to his 7-year-old son, he says, I don't think my theology would be equal to the task. And I just remember that passage in the book. And anyone who's ever had a kid, you just know exactly what Ames is talking about.
You've written something here. Let me just do this one and see what you just to comment on your own writing. And now my guy has started with a drill, so that's just unbelievable. Oh dear, never mind. It's a failure of modern Christianity that we almost never talk of heaven. Christianity believes in the 4 last things: death, judgment, heaven, and hell. They are all indispensable parts of the human condition and the Christian message. Every human being will face them. Now, what I find interesting, you mention how in churches, you tell a story of a writer, I can't remember who it was, who was asked to give a talk in a church, in a Catholic church, and he spoke about basically death and heaven and hell because he hadn't heard about it in church for a long time. And I thought that's fascinating because I think in terms of where we are as human beings, it's so important. And it's a shame that in the church, we've forgotten that core aspect.
Well, I do believe that, David, and I'm thrilled that you light on that passage. Yeah, the writer was Frank Sheed, who founded the publishing firm Sheed and Ward, which published a lot of wonderful Christian apologetic books. And he was asked to preach a sermon in, I think, the cathedral in New York, and he chose to preach on heaven because he'd never in his life heard a sermon on heaven. You know, he'd been attending church for 60 years or something. A bit like Billy Graham wrote a book about angels because he'd never heard a pastor talk about angels. And heaven is a mystery. But I am concerned that our popular culture is desacralising itself and losing a sense of the sacred and the transcendent and the metaphysical. And within my own tradition, the First Vatican Council in the 19th century, the 1870s, whenever it was, is very expansive and detailed in its consideration of the afterlife. It's a bit speculative, but it's trying to work out what heaven is going to be like. By the time you get to the Second Vatican Council, which is generally a good thing, the Second Vatican Council, I'm not an anti-Vatican Council man, but nonetheless, there's a feeling that this kind of concern with the sacred and the transcendent and the supernatural, it's a bit kind of, we should be more kumbaya, wear our folk hymns and let's sit around and, wear our sandals and cheesecloth. And there's an element of, that's all good stuff and so on. But let's not forget the transcendent truths. And so one paradox of heaven that's always perplexed me, but it's not a problem to my faith because I don't mind not knowing the answer to things, is we're going to rise in the body and we're going to live forever in the body. And yet change and decay seem to be of the very essence of humanity. So this is a mystery. This is a transcendent mystery. John Ames reflects, or Marilyn Robinson through John Ames and Gilead reflects, we know for sure that heaven is not going to be a disappointment. But on the other hand, I don't believe that we will lose our regard for this world either. Now, we all believe that we're headed to heaven. We believe in heaven. It's a reality. Jesus said to the good thief, today you will be with me in paradise. And Jesus is not a liar. So this is a core Christian belief. And yet Marilyn Robinson's novel, Gilead, is the first sustained kind of contemplation of heaven that I've read in Christian literature, really. So that does strike me as novel.
Well, it is. Although C.S. Lewis's The Last Battle in the Narnia series is basically a kind of thing of heaven, and his science fiction trilogy, the second one, is it begins to go there. It's fascinating.
I haven't read those, but I will now. I will.
Yeah, well, it's certainly The Last Battle in the Narnia series. It's a quite remarkable description of what heaven is like, and I just admire his genius, like Tolkien's. But I mean, that's interesting, Greg, because the whole aspect of you talk about heaven. Well, what about hell? When did you last hear a sermon on hell? Well, I find it very interesting. There was a fascinating piece. And we haven't said much about television, but do you know the Inspector Morse series?
Oh, very well. Yeah, indeed, very well. Yeah.
So the one where they come to Australia, and they have the thing on the...
Yeah.
You've got to be on the Opera House with Morse, of course, and then they're in the outback. And I just remember this discussion where Lewis says to Morse, do you believe in hell? They've had a particularly horrific murder to look at. And Morse says, I wish I did. I wish I did. I wish there was a hell. And I remember that struck me enormously the first time I saw it, because it's actually a very common perception amongst, I would say, normal people in some ways. And I just think that you're right, we've this desacralization. So I hadn't really intended to go here, but because we're going to have to come back to some of the other novelists you mentioned, Chris Cocke and Piers Paul Reed, and we still haven't got to John Buchan yet. We have to get to the Calvinist Scotsman, the real Calvinist,
Presbyterian Cavalier.
The Presbyterian Cavalier. But I wonder what you think of this. I'm not making this as a political point, but I watched the Australia Day celebrations, mostly from Sydney, but from all over the place. And there was something that struck me about it. It was a combination of, in Britain, what we call children in need, like, look at all what these good volunteers are doing. And then the BBC do a Scottish hogmanay, so... but it was actually, I thought it was done better, and I was very impressed. The fireworks, I mean, one thing's certainly here in Sydney, they know how to do is fireworks. It was really quite extraordinary, beautiful, wonderful. But even Scott Morrison, as a professing Christian, in the whole of that series, in the whole of that show, which is about Australia's values and where we've come from and all that, not one mention of Christianity. Now, historically, that's illiterate. Whether you agree with Christianity or not, that's absolutely illiterate. It just struck me that someone like Marilyn Robinson, or if you had a black gospel choir, or they talked a little bit about Indigenous spirituality, but 80% of Indigenous people in Australia now profess to be Christian, which is the highest percentage of any ethnic group. And it just struck me that one of the reasons that maybe some people don't mention these things, it's not just that they're not aware, but it's that they're scared. They don't want to be labeled as religious. All the subtlety has gone. It's black and white with everything. Whereas people like these really good writers, you can appreciate them even if you don't agree with their theology.
Yes.
Or their politics.
Yeah, look, I think that's a very profound insight. Just a very brief footnote on Morse. In my last book, God is Good for You, I wrote at some length about Morse, very devoted to Morse. Morse is a good example of what the popular culture did to Christianity. The early Morse episodes are tremendously theologically literate. Morse at one point quotes one of my favourite poets, Francis Thompson, the Hound of Heaven. He chased me down the labyrinthine ways of my own days. I did hear his foot and so on. The idea of God chasing you through your life. Morse quotes Pascal's wager in the early episodes. I think the early ones were in about the 1980s. By the end of the series, the writers have become anti-Christian. So Morse, who initially sings in a church choir, is obviously deeply theologically literate at the start. By the end, he goes into a Gothic church, presumably an Anglican one, and says, I've always hated the type of religion that this church represents. And Morse is almost a perfect laboratory example of the popular culture, even as late as the 1980s, feeling a certain affection for Christianity. But by the end of Morse, which I presume was the end of the 1990s or the beginning of the 2000s or something, feeling that it had to be reflexively dismissive, insulting and hostile to Christianity. And, I could go on at length about that. And I mean, don't get me started on the travesty of the Father Brown series, the shocking theological travesty. G.K. Chesterton wrote a series about the most theologically orthodox priest in literature who becomes this kind of weird BBC, touchy-feely, religion isn't true, don't believe in miracles kind of fruitcake under the Father Brown series. But, that's a digression. Your observations about Australia Day are very acute. When I used to go to civic functions when I was a kid or when I started in journalism, you'd often have grace. There'd be grace before meals. People would make a reference to our Lord, one nation under God or something like this. Now, it's a tremendous insult to do that. Now, I admire Scott Morrison. I'm not making any criticism of him. But it's as if Scott Morrison and the New South Wales Premier Dominic Perrottet have established that you are allowed to be a church-going Christian and still occupy high office, but only if you promise never, ever to mention it in public. Christianity is a suspicious activity which should be conducted in private amongst consenting adults and must have no role in the public square. I mean, this is an area where I think the Americans are better than we are. A lot of things wrong with American public culture, including religious elements of American public culture. But every American president would finish a speech, thank you and God bless America. Well, that's a wonderful thing. People regard it as a cliche, but why would you be embarrassed if your whole life is devoted to Christian belief to say God bless Australia? You're not even nominating specifically the Christian God. You know, it can be any sense of a monotheistic God. But if I promise you, if Scott Morrison had said at the end of the Australia Day address, God bless Australia, there would have been howls of abuse and derision and so forth. And one tiny reason for me writing these books, David, is I do want Christians to own their faith in the public square, not to impose it on anybody, but just to own it.
Yeah. By the way, if I was, and I'm sure I'm expecting a phone call after this from his, if I was advising him for the election, I would tell him the story of the Chinese estate agent where we first rented, where I'm recording just now. And we just got talking, and she said, this is a great country. She said, I voted for Scott Morrison. And I said, oh, why did you do that? And she said, well, I'm not religious, but he's a religious man. And I just, I just thought, do you know, we've allowed what I would call it the Twitterati, but I would say a particular section of society to so dominate, and fundamentally they're so intolerant. But I do think that, you know, if people spoke up, so, you know, someone like Marilyn Robinson, I mean, I know people disparage Tolkien now, but I do think if people were more straightforward in just saying, yeah, this is what I believe. I don't impose it on anyone else because my faith actually doesn't allow me to do that. You know, you're not going to get, I mean, in Scotland, the Tartan Taliban, or, you know, you're not, you know, if you're a Christian, you know, oh, you must be, you know, fanatically. I mean, I did hear, I can't remember, I think it was Kevin Rudd. I couldn't believe it. It's just because he was against having a go at Morrison, but talking about Pentecostals by definition being far right.
No, you
have no idea.
Yeah, I don't want to become political, but I was very disappointed in Kevin in saying that. But look, you raise a really critical point, David, which I'd love to come in on. Have you noticed how many books and TV series and movies are based on the idea of a state takeover by fundamentalist Christians? When Christians, fundamentalist, liberal or nominal or whatever, have never been weaker in Western societies in all history. So you have that Canadian writer who wrote The Handmaid's Tale about, so here we are, society is collapsing, you know, there are terrible extremist movements of the left and the right. There's a worldwide Islamist movement, you know, the communist dictatorship in China is on the march. Never in modern history in the West has institutional Christianity been weaker. And yet our screens are full of diabolical fantasies that a cabal of powerful Christians are about to impose a theocracy on the innocent public. There's some new series on the BBC, The Return or something, which again, you know, thinks that there's this terrible danger of fundamentalist Christians. You know, the Oxford Union a few years ago wouldn't let the Evangelical Union appear in Orientation Week because they wanted to preserve a safe space for students. So the Evangelical Union, of course, is famous for roughing up students, I guess, you know, for coming out and beating up students who don't wear a fish in their lapel badge or something. It just shows the culture has gone completely crackers, in my view.
Yeah, and that's maybe a good place for us to finish, because we're going to. I wasn't intending doing a third one on culture, but we are. We have to come back to Buchan and Koch and others. The Canadian writers Margaret Atwood, The Handmaid's Tale. I wrote a review of it, and I prophesied at the time, and it's a prophecy that's come true, that Margaret Atwood may well be right in terms of some of the authoritarian tendencies within society, but it will come. She's more likely to be cancelled by her own side than to be cancelled by, you know, any kind of, you know, wacko Confederate, you know, American right-wing takeover. You know, that was, and the irony of that is just simply that's what's happened. I mean, she was attacked and cancelled for a couple of things, but particularly on the whole trans issue. But it is very interesting that there's a sense in which you've written about this input of Christ into the culture, and we've mentioned numerous things out of that, and you talk music, art, literature, and so on. And I'd almost want to do a whole other one on the Antichrist thing, but the Antichrist thing is the sense of demonizing. So, people, how is it associated in people's minds that if you're a Catholic priest, you're likely to be a pedophile? Now, it's less than 5%. It's about the same statistic as for any other group, but that's in popular imagery. And if we look at the way that Christians are portrayed in soap operas, or as I say, like in Atwood's Handmaid's Tale, there is all that stuff that comes up. And I do think the only way that we do counter that is providing not a political solution, but I would say a Christian narrative. We need more Tolkien's, we need more C.S. Lewis's, we need more Marilyn Robinson's, and we need more seeping through of culture in that. I mean, ironically, some of the most conservative people socially I know are people who, are African Americans, who, when they bring their gospel choirs over, everyone absolutely adores them. And then they sing. So I'll just tell you one story, and then I'll let you have something to say to finish. We had a choir brought over. It wasn't African American, it was from Africa. And they came to the Scottish Parliament, and they were wonderful, Watoto Children's Choir. And the guy who's leading them told me that the parliamentary staff said to them, you should stand up and sing whatever you want, but just don't mention Jesus or any religious stuff. And the kids looked and said, we haven't got anything else. And so they stood up and did it anyway. And I just thought, how sad, how sad that we are so culturally insecure that they want to exclude what is in people's hearts, And I just, it's, yeah, you're right. It's gone mad in that way. Anyway, I'm going to let you have the last word.
Well, David, you should be very disturbed by how furiously we are in agreement. I think this is going to be bad for your career and might count against you.
Well, my career's finished.
At the pearly gates, but to cite a couple of other examples, there's this American TV series called Riverdale, based on the Archie Andrews comics. It's a bit gothic, but it has an order of nuns who kidnap and torture young girls. Now, a lot of Catholic priests misbehaved, and I'm ashamed of them. I don't think there's any record anywhere of nuns doing this kind of thing. And, the dear nuns who the early AIDS sufferers at St Vincent's Hospital, the nuns stuck by them when everyone was scared of them. They lifted the drinks to their mouths as they died. They held their hands to give them courage at the end. And yet, what's the portrayal of a nun in Riverdale? A sadistic sexual torturer. In the Australian series Dr. Doctor, there was a Christian character, a fundamentalist Protestant, and she was a nice person, so that was a great thing. But, of course, she was a nut, and her ideas were ridiculous, and she was regarded as the kook on the series. And, of course, there was an episode glorifying the joys of euthanasia. Every time euthanasia is presented in a movie or a TV series, it's regarded as a wonderful, heroic, fabulous thing. And you're right. The best way to counter it is by just producing our own product, which is fantastically good. We haven't talked about that wonderful series where I didn't write about in my book called The Chosen, just which Christians put together with crowdsourced money and so on. Marilyn Robinson's book, Gilead, I haven't met a single person who's been disappointed by reading that book, including people who have no religious belief whatsoever. And that book won the Pulitzer Prize. Now, the idea of the Pulitzer Prize going to an overtly Christian book with a long contemplation of the nature of heaven as a deep reality, and with a character, John Ames, who is not a saint, but who is a decent Protestant, Congregationalist, Orthodox Christian minister, mirabile dictu. This is a miracle. But what we need, therefore, is simply, to tell the story, because the truth in the end should triumph. We have this enormous advantage that we're trying to tell the truth, even if we tell it very imperfectly. But, David, I just can't tell you how much fun it is to talk about these issues with you. And obviously your neighbour is enthralled by this discussion because the bangs and everything else have stopped.
Yeah, I'm gonna send them a copy. But you know, you're talking about writing, and I'm not trying to, you know, praise you too much, but I do think that your own writing is really helpful in terms of presenting, you know, the Christian cause. I mean, I know people who won't listen to me. Oh, you're some kind of religious nut, who'll listen to you. And then I know people, by the way, who are extremely confused because you're Catholic, you know, and aren't we supposed to hate each other, you know, and all this kind of stuff. And somebody actually said to me, I think you're just faking it. I think the two of you, but we're not. It's honestly, I find this incredibly, stimulating and helpful, and I hope those who are watching do as well. So we'll catch up again in a fortnight.
Thanks so much, David.
Okay?
Fantastic to talk to you. Thanks so much. Now, should I hang on for a second while you make sure